Good morning to those of you who were able to get up early in the morning. Welcome. It's quite difficult to see if you're at the back, because this light is kind of blinding, but if there are people at the back, I would suggest you come forward so we can make you out. Okay, we are starting a little bit late, and we do have a very good panel of people who know far more about this subject than I do. So I'm essentially going to kick right off into the discussions. And the marching order that we've put together is that we will start with Piet du Plooy. We have 3 presentations, formal PowerPoint presentations. So Piet du Plooy will go first. Then I'll ask Ahmed to present. And then we'll go to Padmashri. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And then John Mugabe is a kind of Uber discussant, if you like. So he's not going to present. He's going to look for common threads, points of disagreement, perhaps, etc., and act as a discussant for all 3 presentations. And then I'd like to open up to the floor and hopefully get as much interaction as possible. So without further ado, Piet, let me hand over to you.
Okay, cute little graph there. Good morning to all of you. Just a very basic introduction on technology, and this comes straight from technology, from Wikipedia. Making technology is the making, using, and understanding of tools, and it's pretty much key, has been historically, to the survival of mankind. The ability to wield technology has been the ability to overcome nature. But to jump straight into, I think, where we are in Africa, an African COP. For Africa, the challenge really very much revolves around energy. And we've got this huge infrastructure gap that needs to be addressed on the continent. So a lot of the discussion around technology ultimately for Africa comes down to discussion on being able to access energy technology. And so for the bulk of this talk, that will be the perspective that I take. It's noteworthy that energy didn't make it as one of the Millennium Development Goals, and probably is interlinked with each one of them. And this is something that we'll probably see addressed over the course of next year's big event, Rio +20, around sustainable development. But just to note that the challenge ahead of us is really to move from one of our oldest technologies as mankind, namely fire, to some of our latest technologies, photovoltaics, electric vehicles, and that sort of thing. So it really is a technological revolution, and I think that's why the issue of technology is so central. We've got to stop burning things. That's the core of the mitigation message around climate change. So I just want to put up some of the numbers because this becomes relevant later on in the talk. We are investing. There's a lot of money going into renewable energy, clean energy investment in general. You see there 2004 to 2009, 130 billion in North America, 200 billion in Europe. But the numbers required amounts to something like $46 trillion over the next 40 years. Compared to that, adaptation costs are relatively modest. I'm not dismissing the cost of adaptation. It's obviously very relevant. I'm just saying that the relative cost of adaptation is relatively modest. And that for Africa in particular, there's this need to simultaneously effectively leapfrog technology while providing this very basic need for the continent of energy provision. We can't have economic growth without access to energy, and it's going to be likely clean energy. So $560 billion requirement by 2030 for energy. In terms of the research and development on energy, the new technologies, in 2009 we saw R&D of $25 billion, but noteworthy that 60% of this came from the private sector. The spread geographically dominated by the US, the EU, and Japan, which together, as you see there, make up more than 70% of total R&D. But noteworthy is that the private sector is the main player in all of these countries. In the OECD, it's 2/3 of all R&D is invested by the private sector, and in China, it's even more pronounced. 72% of all R&D in China comes from the private sector. The absolute basics for people involved in this area, that technology is disseminated through a number of channels, trade, investment, and licensing, but that in real life, if you look at how technology spreads and how it's diffused, there's a very instructive example in Africa in the form of how mobile phone technology, effectively a leapfrogging technology, is spread on the continent, from 54 million subscriptions in 2003 and to 350 million only 5 years later. Massive increase, disseminated without a policy that said we will disseminate mobile phones across the continent. It was very much a needs-driven dissemination. So quite a bit from some of the work by Ian Harvey. Why intellectual property? What role does intellectual property play in this? It's an incentive for risky investments. There is risk involved. You don't know if the technology that you're developing is going to lead in the end to commercial gain. It provides legal clarity and certainty for technology transfer. When speaking to an intellectual property right lawyer, he highlighted to me and reminded me that part of the reason why patents were invented, if you will, was so that technology could be shared, so that people would publish their technology and not just keep it to themselves. It also stops others from blocking the use of a technology and follow-on developments. And Harvey makes this point that intellectual property right really fundamentally provides choice. It provides choice to give, transfer, sell, or license so that others can invest in its future technology, in its future development. He also makes the point that owning intellectual property rights is separate from the decision on whether to charge for them or not. It does secure the investment in technology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to lead to additional costs. Now, intellectual property right isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems for every nation. It's only effective, really, when there's appropriate infrastructure, when the governance systems are effective, and when there's competition systems. And I'll come back to this point about competition later on. In least developed countries, in fact, we know that intellectual property rights may be a barrier or prevent some sort of informal transfer through processes like reverse engineering. In least developed countries, the absence of intellectual property rights is also overshadowed by other risks for investors. An investor is not going to look at a least developed country where there's war, for example, and say, we won't invest there because they don't have intellectual property right, a strict intellectual property right regime. Other factors can overwhelm the impact of intellectual property rights in encouraging trade, investment, or licensing, the three channels by which technology is diffused. So, a point that I want to raise at this point, we've often heard, you would know, that the debate around intellectual property rights and the debate from technology often leads directly into one on intellectual property rights, is often overshadowed by the cost or the understood cost of intellectual property rights to developing nations. But something that's worth highlighting here is what would be the cost of failing to innovate. Now, we're pretty sure that existing technology can achieve the mitigation required for the most part. The International Energy Agency reckons existing technology can cater for 70% of the mitigation requirement. But a very critical reality, and remember I quoted a number of $46 trillion investment over the next 20 years, is without continuous development, without further innovation, all of this will come at a much higher price tag. So $20 trillion more if innovation were for some reason to stop today. And the implication is if intellectual property rights are compromised and therefore a driver for the predominantly private sector to continue to innovate, there's a significant price tag attached to that. Now, the following two slides looks very much at the Chatham House work on scanning the intellectual property right landscapes for 6 key clean technologies. And it's very clear that in terms of the ownership of intellectual property rights, not surprisingly, given what we know about who invests in clean technology R&D, multinationals dominate. There is a measure of concentration. So the top 20 companies generally own about 30% of all patents. It's also notable that in terms of countries, the USA, Japan, and Germany dominate the ownership of intellectual property rights. A country like China has a relatively small share of overall intellectual property. But very noteworthy is that despite this fact, China, as we know, dominates in world production and investment and export of many of these technologies, despite the fact that it's only a minor owner of many of these technologies. So this, to an extent, belies the fact that dominance in the intellectual property right space leads automatically to dominance in terms of investment in or export, production and export of green technologies. So in terms of the negotiations to date, intellectual property rights per se are not expressly included under the UN Framework Convention nor under the Kyoto Protocol. We know the language, UNFCCC says that parties should take all, specifically Annex 1 parties should take all practicable steps to promote, facilitate, and finance. And the finance is the one I'd like to highlight here, as appropriate, the transfer of or access to environmentally sound technologies and know-how. Intellectual property rights really started featuring prominently in the debate in the run-up to Bali, and much of this has its roots in the Agenda 21 from 1992, where the language was around or one of the recommendations was for the purchase, and that's worth highlighting. It's not about alienating intellectual property rights. It's about properly paying for them. The purchase of patents and licenses on commercial terms for their transfer to developing countries on non-commercial terms as part of development cooperation for sustainable development, taking into account the need to protect intellectual property rights. So there was never a question, at least in Rio, around somehow watering down intellectual property right regimes. It's always been the case it was always set in the context, the dissemination of these, or the spreading of these this intellectual property was always in the context of protection for intellectual property rights. Now, the pace of dissemination is worth looking at. Registering a patent can take about 3 years. And it's also clear that if you look at the patenting, the graph of a number of patenting trends across the 6 technologies, PV, wind, carbon capture, CSP, biomass, and clean coal, that there has been a significant upturn in these patents from around 2000, or 1998, really. In contrast, investment has only really taken off since about 2004. You'll see a similar graph delayed by about 7 years. So there's roughly a 7-year, that patenting is a leading indicator for investment by about 7 years. But according to again, the Chatham House study, it takes an average of 24 years to disseminate the technology, and that space will have to be accelerated if we to achieve mitigation targets as expressed by the IPCC recommendations. Now, in terms of the costs of intellectual property right, these are very much kept in check and a number of authors have found this, are kept in check by competition. It's not that any one company owns all of the technologies. There are many companies and more every day that compete to provide their product, and this drives down costs over time. So the WBCSD says, although without a lot of evidence, that the cost of IPR is small compared to other soft costs like innovation infrastructure or the building of absorptive capacity. Intellectual property rights are certainly a more significant cost if you are looking to manufacture. There you have to find, you have to bring the intellectual property into your manufacturing process. It's not just included in a traded product. But the reality is that manufacturing most of these high technology products is not entirely likely across, say, least developed countries. And we've seen in South Africa as well, with recent work done, that it contributes a small portion of the overall jobs, which is part of the promise of adopting green energy technologies. So, a couple of observations with this as background. One is that a solution to the global climate challenge will have to include the use of all the tools we have at our disposal, the ones that have been developed over the course of years, and the protection of intellectual property rights is certainly one of them, alongside competition. Climate action fundamentally requires that a lot of the value in the world becomes dematerialized, that we decouple economies from physical resources, from the production of more and more widgets, or certainly the production of more widgets using new materials, but that we have an economy that moves towards services. This cannot be done while eroding property rights in this virtual world, the world of non-material things. So just as property rights have to be protected in the world of physical things, intellectual property protects some of our virtual property. And we cannot, it would be tough to move into a world where virtual property becomes ever more dominant while eroding those rights. This for me is from the forthcoming paper, SIA paper that I wrote, probably the key point. The challenge for developing countries on participating in climate technology markets as suppliers, and not exclusively as buyers, lies not so much in their ability to access and pay for intellectual property, which we've shown is not a massive cost, but rather in their ability to transform intellectual property into products through access to the required means of production, including skills, materials, production capacity, and finance. So briefly, 4 key recommendations. The first is that we ideally should redefine the debate to reflect how technology moves in real life. Technology is not transferred between governments. It's a process of sharing technology between largely companies, who are the originators of most of this technology, and into the hands of Joe Public. Diffusion happens through the private sector. It's a process that isn't driven by law, so it's diffusion rather than transfer. And this is something to consider in the way that we talk about technology diffusion, I'd argue, rather than technology transfer. Also, given the complexity of the UNFCCC negotiations as we're seeing going on not far from here, it means that we should really avoid the contamination of this critical UNFCCC process by the spillover of unresolved WTO issues. We're finding that for a lot of global multilateral issues are spilling over into the UNFCCC negotiations. So an agreement on the protection of intellectual property rights, complemented by mechanisms around technology, the dissemination of technology, so for example, Climate Technology Center, is probably the way to achieve this, to basically build a firewall between the two processes. Another issue worth considering is that in-country effective competition policy can help to contain costs. Without this other non-competitive behavior, monopoly suppliers, for example, can lead to much larger costs than intellectual property rights themselves. Intellectual property rights internationally, the cost of those are contained by the fact that there's reasonable competition in almost every technology. If the domestic environment is uncompetitive, whatever happens in intellectual property becomes relatively irrelevant. Also, we note that there's a problem of absorptive capacity in developing countries, and this can certainly be addressed by something like a funding window for research and capacity building under a finance mechanism that applies to developing nations in particular and could take the form of something like salary support, grant type support for salaries of R&D personnel in country. The public sector has a specific role to play in basic research, and basic researchers have to be retained while competing with the private sector. This can be done through some sort of salary support to be able to keep researchers in country for developing nations. The other is to close the innovation gap or the commercialization gap, that sometimes the technologies are developed, they just don't get implemented at scale because they get stuck at the point of demonstration and eventually commercialization. And another finance window, one that specifically supports the additional costs of demonstration projects in non-Annex 1 countries, can help address this. So in conclusion, I think it's notable that many of the technology issues often translate into finance issues. And currently these are treated separately under UNFCCC process. There might be some scope to see how finance and technology, where the common solutions lie between the finance and technology streams. Instruments, any sort of solution should also consider where the diffusion issue lies, whether the diffusion at a particular stage is best achieved by the public sector, which tends to be at the earlier stages of research and demonstration, or by the private sector, which is probably best at commercializing products. Governments are not the ones who commercialize products and roll them out at scale. That is a private sector competency. And finally, it's noteworthy that beyond the demonstration scale, the diffusion and commercialization of technology depends mostly on an enabling domestic policy environment and regulatory environment to drive the uptake of an investment in climate resilient technology. I think a case in point in South Africa is it's not for lack of intellectual property right protection that renewable energy had not taken off essentially to this day. What was missing was a proper procurement regime, something equivalent to a feed-in tariff, an energy plan that involved, that clearly designated the need for larger and mandated the need for larger procurement of renewable energy, that really drove that and will continue to drive into the future the uptake of these clean technologies. That's it for my part. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be presenting the results of a recent report that we've just published at UNCTAD, which deals with renewable energy technologies and promoting its uptake in developing countries. It looks basically at the technology and innovation challenges inherent to this entire debate. Just as background, the Technology and Innovation Report is a new report series at UNCTAD. It's what we call a flagship report at UNCTAD. It's the second of its series, and it's expected to analyze various issues for inducing technological change and innovation in developing countries in different areas of relevance. The key focus of the report is really on how can we reduce energy poverty while mitigating climate change at the same time. And the focus of the report is on the important role of technology and innovation in expanding the application and wider acceptance of renewable energy technologies, which is a subset of clean technologies that we're discussing this morning. Well, the report is comprehensive. It looks at a variety of things. Why is it important to look at energy poverty within the climate change discourse? What is the growing role of renewable energy technologies in energy systems? What are the technology and innovation issues in this? What are the key international policy challenges? What can national governments do in developing countries to promote the greater use of renewable energy technologies? This is a sort of a, if you would, this is a sort of a world map. If you would take the territory size to be proportional to the percentage of world electricity production that occurs there, it sort of gives you an idea of what the key problem is that we're dealing with. So if you see Africa, how small it looks, especially sub-Saharan Africa, key parts of Asia, when compared to the enlarged size of USA and European countries. Just this way of summarizing what we've analyzed on the role of renewable energy. Over 20% of the global population has no access to energy at all, and most of these people live in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Renewable energy as a solution offers new hope because it can be combined with conventional energy sources through mini-grid and off-grid applications, and really to reach local poor communities. And we basically look at renewable energies based on wind, solar, and biomass, although there's a whole range, hydropower and the ocean wave technologies and other new technologies. Working closely with the International Renewable Energy Agency on this report, IRENA, we've looked at projections that show a significant increase by 2030 worldwide. But also what we see, if we take the last 5 years itself, we see that renewable energy actually accounted for about half of all the power sector additions worldwide. Although, if you just take developing countries, the figure looks a bit different. So a lot of the additions are happening in the developed world, whereas in the developing world, there is a scaling up, but it needs to be expanded upon. So just looking at the global electricity supply by energy source for last year, if you take renewable energy out other than hydropower, the share of renewables for power generation is just 3.3%. With hydropower, it's about 19%. Just giving us, the breakdown. Now, one of the reasons why we're seeing an uptake of renewable energy is clearly that there is technological progress going on in the sector, which is reducing the cost of renewable energies when compared to 10 years ago. So if you take solar photovoltaic or other technologies like wind, they are now extremely competitive. In the African power sector, actually certain renewable energies are more competitive than using generators and also conventional energy through grid. And the demand for modern energy has gone up in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, leading to a greater use or greater exploration of renewable energies in mini-grid and off-grid applications. We find that there's a strong relationship between technology and innovation capacity and the wider use of renewable energies. The report calls it as a sort of a virtuous cycle of integration. What we find is that on the one hand, you have actually low industrial development in a lot of developing countries, for which weak physical infrastructure is the cause, of which energy is key. So on the one hand, you need energy to increase industrial development opportunities in these countries. But at the same time, you need some threshold of innovation capacity, not only to engage in production or R&D of renewable energy, but also to simply use, adapt, and disseminate renewable energies. Therefore, the success of renewable energy technology-related technology transfer initiatives will really depend on the ability of actors in developing countries to absorb and apply these technologies, and therefore the need to look slightly beyond the classic technology transfer discourse to how we can actually build technology assimilation capabilities in these countries. And the absence of technological and innovation capacities is therefore constantly likely to undermine national strategies to promote the greater use of renewable energies. I don't know what happened to that slide. There should be a, no, it's gone. Okay, there should be a table in this slide. In the table, basically, it captures the heterogeneity of technological capacity amongst developing countries for engaging in renewable energy-related activities. You see a whole range of the so-called emerging developing countries, India's and China's and Brazil's, engaging in production and innovation in sort of solar photovoltaic, wind energy, wind turbines, biodiesel, biofuels, also signifying that the market is changing, it's constantly evolving. So the market shares of different firms, where you see USA, Japan, and Germany holding significant market shares, is changing with India's and China's and so on, giving a lot of competitive thrust and bringing down the prices. But at the same time, there is an entire range of developing countries, smaller developing countries with lower technological capacity, and the so-called least developed countries, which are not figuring in this changing market landscape for energy production. So while we are talking about how national governments will need to tip the balance in favor of renewable energy, technological capacity is key, of course. They need to try and build some level of technological capacity even for the application of renewable energy. But at the same time, you need specific policy support to substitute current patterns of resource use to more renewable energy-based resource use. Of key concern here is subsidies to conventional fuels in a lot of countries. Then making RETs viable solutions within a systemic perspective, because it's not just for use at homes, but also in industries, and also to enable enterprise development in and through RETs. And looking at the international discourse, we find that it needs to be framed in a different way, with an equal focus on climate change and reduction of energy poverty. As my previous speaker already noted, you have adaptation technologies or adaptation costs under the climate change framework, but adaptation is just a part of the problem in resolving energy poverty. And if you see the funding that is allocated internationally for transition to different energy, for meeting the universal energy targets, you see that UNFCCC funds is just one of them. There's a whole range of funding activity going on from a variety of sources. But on the whole, even if you take all this into account, it's just a fraction of what is needed to eradicate energy poverty. The International Renewable Energy Agency, for instance, estimates that Africa alone needs 40 billion in its power sector annually to actually deal with this problem. We find that central to this repositioning is the triangular relationship between equity, development, and the environment, where equity and the right of all the people to access energy and to engage in industrial development will also play a key role. So obligations for mitigation of climate change should be framed equally in terms of opportunities for all. This calls for a commensurate focus on RETs within the international technology discourse, of course, but this needs to be equally accompanied by financing and by investment, greater public investment. I'm going to summarize this very, very shortly in the interest of time. There is a whole range of international issues that the report looks at and makes policy recommendations on. You can broadly sort of classify that under financing, technology transfer, technology diffusion, and technology assimilation activities, and what needs to be done in the wake of the green economy and the Rio +20. Basically, on the question of I will focus very closely on the question of technology, since that's our focus this morning. On the question of technology transfer and diffusion, we find that that the entire landscape, although you see increased patenting going on, and although you see that the emerging developing countries are also having a greater share in patenting activities, when you compare patenting in USA, Germany, or Japan, and then you compare that to India, China, Brazil, you find that the emerging economy patenting is significantly a small share of the total patenting activity. That said, there are very few studies on what this really means for market concentration and market share in this entire sector. The little data that exists shows that patenting in the renewable energies, or more broadly, some taking into account also carbon capture storage, some of the clean energy technologies, might not represent significant amount of market concentration. So, for instance, in the it depends on the technology. In solar photovoltaic, you see that patent does not confer a significant amount of market share, whereas in the case of wind energy technologies, it might be that patenting confers a significant amount of market share. So one needs to be cautious when one is analyzing the impact of intellectual property on what is going to happen in this sector. But at the same time, we don't want to have the same result that we had in certain other sectors, which were of public importance, which is also something we need to pay attention to. So it's sort of a mixed bag, and one needs to take into account the different sides of the picture. Plus, the presence or absence of intellectual property in this sector currently is not of great significance to developing countries which don't have the technological capacity to produce. So in these contexts, we really need to focus a lot more on how we can share technology to build technological capacity and to encourage them to widely deploy renewable energy. The issues of finance that the report has looked at, the issue of the role of the private sector and how it can be strengthened, and how developing country firms need more support in order to continue with their productive activities in the wake of the Rio Plus 20 and the green economy. So I won't go deeply into that. This is a point I already made. Diffusion of renewable energy technologies involves much more than simply transferring hardware. Everybody stressed on it, but I think that we need to move further on it. We need to look at what it does mean. If it doesn't mean just transferring hardware, what does it really entail? The report also talks about international support mechanisms that can be put in place for technological support in developing countries. Looking at the new technology mechanism and the entire developments around the technological mechanism under the UNFCCC, and how that can be better coordinated with the International Innovation Center, which was recently approved at the UNLDC4 conference, with a specific focus for promoting technological learning activities in LDCs. There is a key focus area of this center as it currently stands, that relates to climate change mitigation technologies. And so how can these initiatives be integrated more closely, and how can we have some sort of scope? There are many policy instruments that are important for renewable energy technologies within, there's another, it's funny. At the national level, the report looks at a series of policy recommendations that countries should consider. Fundamentally, it talks about an integrated innovation policy framework, which looks at innovation policy incentives within the innovation framework, but also within the energy sector, because a lot of the innovation incentives for application, wider deployment, and use comes from energy sector incentives. It looks at renewable energy-based targets and strategies, portfolio standards and feed-in tariffs policies, training programs, elimination of conventional subsidies. And it basically concludes by proposing how RITs can lead to a greater and greener catch-up process. What we find really that a lot of the cases that we've studied in the report show that eliminating energy poverty through renewable energy doesn't require large-scale funding at the inception. There can be small projects which can go a long way, and at the same time you need to mobilize finance to actually replicate them on a larger scale. And also, of course, creating an innovation policy framework for this kind of technological change should not be considered a daunting exercise. So that's, I think, something that, so that's more or less summarizing the report. The report is available on our website, and I've also got overviews outside. There are a few copies with me, so if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to disseminate. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. I will try to speak a bit, to complement the previous presentation by mentioning a bit what is the situation under UNFCCC now in relation to the technology mechanism, and mostly focus on technology issues, but also presenting some of the work we have done at ICTSD on intellectual property and the empirical evidence we have found. So I think it has been, widely emphasized that technology is key in tackling the climate change challenge. But the problem is that there are so many technologies out there, and it's problematic to do generalizations. Each technology has its history, has its specificities, has its specific market configuration, etc. And I think there has been a lot of emphasis on the well-known mitigation technologies, wind, solar, etc. But there's all kind of pro-poor technologies. There is water irrigation technologies, etc., that maybe we know a little less about. So it's an ongoing learning process, I think, still on all these technologies. So it makes it very difficult to have a general discussion in terms of prescriptive recommendations. But nevertheless, I think that the creation of the technology mechanism at Cancun last year was an important development, was an important breakthrough. Why was this the case? Because really, it really marked a turning point in the discussions on technology in the climate convention. The traditional 2 points of view you had in these discussions for many years was, on one side, industrialized countries basically saying, technology transfer is about enabling environment at the domestic level in developing countries, right? This is where you need to tackle. You need to have the right enabling environment. There's not much you can do internationally other than fostering this enabling environment, encouraging it, etc. Developing countries are saying, well, no, that is part of the story, but also you need mechanisms, you need measures in the context of multilateral regimes to foster, to catalyze, to encourage technology transfer. And the technology mechanism, I think, really moves us forward from this impasse that had prevailed for a long time. And it really strengthens the technology pillar of the UNFCCC Convention, and it shows that you can have such a mechanism at the international level. Of course, in the way the mechanism is designed, I think it captures well also the views and the way industrialized countries and developing countries approach the issue of technology transfer and diffusion. You can see it in the structure of the mechanism. You have on the one side the Technology Executive Committee, which is more of a policy body that looks in a general manner at technological needs, barriers, kind of a prescriptive manner. And you have the Climate Technology Center and Network, which is more the operational arm of the mechanism, and I think which will do a lot of the practical work in it. So we still have a number of unresolved issues that I've tried to point it out in this slide regarding this mechanism. The relationship between the tech and the CTCN is still undefined, and is one of the issues that should be settled by the end of this week in Durban. Part of it is also the way these two bodies relate to the technology mechanism and to the bodies of the convention. The governance of the Climate Technology Center and Network, the relationship between the technology mechanism and the Green Fund, the issue of financing, and that's a key issue. I mean, you can spend a lot of time on discussing the mechanism, etc. If it doesn't have the sufficient financing, it will not be effective. So the relationship with the Green Fund is also very important. But I think it is a breakthrough. It is an important development that I think should receive greater attention. So we see that the technology mechanism represents a more dynamic approach, let's say, to technology transfer. It has an emphasis on increased R&D cooperation, moving from technology needs assessments that have been done a lot under the UNFCCC to national action plans on technology, for example, national roadmaps on technology. This creation of facilitation of a network of technology and innovation center. There's an emphasis on innovation in the work of the technology mechanism that you didn't find as explicit, as importantly highlighted before in the work of the UNFCCC in this area, and of course also the issue of public-private partnerships. However, I think all this remains, if you read the mandate of the technology mechanism, all this remains quite abstract and very general, and we need to flesh it out. And in fleshing out these functions, again, we're faced with a number of challenges. As I mentioned, the diversity of technologies and of technological needs. Even developing countries, have very diverse technological needs. How do you capture this in the work of the mechanism? How do you ensure synergies with national efforts? You have a lot of work on technology and innovation going at the national level in countries. How is this going to be articulated with the Climate Center and Network, the regional innovation centers, etc.? That is also an interesting thing to look at. And finally, you need an engagement of all stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, and particularly from developing countries. I mean, I think if we want to avoid that this becomes a top-down international structure, you need to foster a critical engagement from stakeholders in developing countries to be more involved in the way all this infrastructure, this institutional regime will develop. Yeah, this is just it's interesting again to look at the focus on innovation in the mechanism. A lot of emphasis on clean energy innovation. I think it's a positive development. So the word innovation is more explicitly mentioned in different aspects of the work and of the mechanism, the priority areas, in the way the network is articulated. And I think that's also a very interesting development to look at. Maybe to complement a bit what is something that has been mentioned. And I think that falls off the conversation, right? Is the role of public funding, right? And I think it's sometimes not given enough attention. I think there's no doubt that the private sector has the lead role in R&D in clean energy technologies. I think Pete mentioned 60% of global R&D, but well, you have then 40% that is done by the public sector, right? So what do you do about that, right? And that merits, I think, some reflection. So technology and R&D are not just in the hands of the private sector, they're also in the hands of government-funded institutions, government research centers, universities, and I think there is and this issue goes back to the Rio Summit in 1992, Agenda 21, that was mentioned also by Pete, which mentions about the formulation of policies and programs for the effective transfer of environmentally sound technologies that are publicly owned or in the public domain. And there is a legitimate, I think, discussion about whether the results of publicly funded research should be disseminated, diffused on the same basis as privately owned R&D, developed technologies, etc. It's an interesting debate, I think, and it's ongoing in a number of areas. And it's interesting to look, for example, at the EU, what's happening in the EU, just to give an example about this link, right? In the EU, they have adopted an open access policy that now, if you, as a researcher, as a scientific institutions in the European Union, your research is publicly funded, right? We are heading almost towards an obligation in the European Union that publicly funded research should be widely disseminated through open access publications of scientific data and papers, right? It's quite interesting to see that, right? And it marks the difference between publicly funded and privately funded, right? That the dissemination and diffusion maybe, again, I'm opening the questioning, I don't have the answer, but maybe it should not be done on the same terms in all cases, and particularly when it comes to developing countries, these developing countries. Something also that doesn't receive a lot of attention in this debate, and I just maybe wanted to put some attention on it. There's a lot of very interesting bilateral cooperation going on in all these areas. Between the US and China, there's the US-China Clean Energy Forum. Between developing countries in the India, Brazil, South Africa partnership. Between China and India have a cooperation agreement, EU and India. And all these frameworks, all these fora have an important element of science and technology cooperation. The US-China Clean Energy Forum, even they have reached an agreement on intellectual property rights, actually, within this US-China Clean Energy Forum. So very positive, actually, experiences, I think. And often the multilateral debate is very polarized, very acrimonious, etc. And we don't collect in it, we don't capture these good, interesting bilateral and regional exchanges and experiences in the bilateral discussions. So these are some thoughts on the technology discussion in the UNFCCC and how it's proceeding. And so I think we're moving ahead in this discussion, but it needs inputs, it needs, I think, a stronger engagement. If we move to intellectual property rights, I will just present some of the work we've done this in terms of empirical evidence and ICTSD, and I think many of you are familiar with it. Now, the issue of I think, we take the availability of information relating to clean energy technologies or to technologies, the availability of patent information as a given, right? Or information of IPRs. We take it as something that is out there and that is easy accessible, and it's not the case. It is not the case. If you're trying to look for patent information, if you're an entrepreneur, a businessman, or someone, good luck. I mean, you need to go through databases. You need to do multiple searches. You know, blah blah blah. So we think of it as a given, but it's not a given. And we went through this exercise in a study we did with the European Patent Office and the United Nations Environment Program, right? And it consists of a patent landscape report and a licensing survey, and it ended up also providing a new classification, a new patent classification for clean energy technologies. But it is not the only patent landscape report that is out there. There have been others, and we try to build on the efforts that have been previously done. But the way I think it differs is that it tries to first to do it through a partnership between different institutions, because I think you need different institutions to come together to do these kinds of exercise, because there are some institutions who have a better knowledge of the renewable technologies, such as UNEP, for example. They have a very good expertise in the area. You need institutions who have a stronger expertise in the area of patent information, for example, and how to process it. And we were a civil society organization, and we've been working on IPRs for a long time. So, so the idea of the partnership is important. The idea of the methodology used is important. Again, this issue of patent information is like looking for something in a big, it's looking into a big wood, I would say, or a lot of trees, you know. Depending on the methodology using, the further you go, the more you're gonna, it's like a lens. Depending on the lens you go, you will go deeper into the wood of what you're trying to find. So we try to develop the methodology that was that using the expertise of the European Patent Office, and it led to a number of the results that confirm maybe a bit fine-tuned previous result in this area. And the other important aspect is that I think it has been also mentioned by Pete that the ownership of the IPRs is not the only important thing, is how to use the ownership. You know, you can have the ownership but let it use for free, patent, etc. So then the licensing is important. How do you license? And that's an area where you have very few studies, very little information, because licensing practices are part of the confidential information of companies, of their corporate strategies, etc. It's not easy to have availability. But in this survey, we reached out also again to International Business Association that helped us actually reach to their members, to technology holders, to see what is the situation of licensing. In this process, we did not think this in the beginning, but it resulted in the creation by the European Patent Office of a new classification for clean energy generation technologies, right? A patent classification. So it's not only a study, the study ended up with a practical tool. And this practical tool, again, it tries. It's a small effort. It's not the final solution on it, but it tries to address this issue of the complexity of finding the information by providing one place where you can go and you would easily find information on patent status of renewables, solar, wind, etc. You enter the database. If you're interested in South Africa, you look South Africa, solar, etc. Different classification, and you get it easily instead of having to go through the classification through manufacturing, etc. for different things. Among the findings of the patent landscape is there has been an important growth in patenting of clean energy technology that has been mentioned. There's probably solar photovoltaic coming on top of it. But again, I mean, that is not that exceptional if you look at the rates of patenting in general and the increase of patenting rates in the world in general, right? There has been a general increase of patenting in many areas, and so that is not that exceptional, but it takes off really with the Kyoto Protocol, so it shows a bit that decisions or commitments taken at UNFCCC can have an influence on the rate of innovation in this. It is dominated, it has also been mentioned, has been dominated by mostly OECD countries, but again, that is not that exceptional because it reflects the average of patent ownership in most technologies that, again, mostly dominated by industrialized countries. So it's not, that again is not that exceptional. In terms of the licensing survey, that really was, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of the exercise. It showed that there is relatively limited licensing to developing countries across clean energy technologies. Most of the entities that responded said they had never licensed their technology to developing countries. And that shows that most of the licensing is going with between industrialized countries, actually. Or it is going, and then we see that when we ask them which are the most important countries for the licensing, particularly non-OECD countries, it's usually the usual suspects that come out: India, Brazil, China, Russia, a bit South Africa also. So there is some licensing going on, but mostly to a small number of countries. And finally, we asked the respondents if they were willing to provide more flexible licensing terms to developing countries, and most of the respondents said yes. So I think that there's a lot of goodwill there among technology holders to provide more flexible licensing terms to developing countries. We asked also about which factors really impacted more on technology holders when they come to license clean energy technologies, and there was a number of factors. IPRs was one of them, scientific capabilities and infrastructure was another one, favorable market conditions, favorable investment climate, and the protection of IP was an important factor, no doubt, but slightly more important were also other factors relating to market conditions, investment climate, etc. So it's an important factor, but within also other maybe factors that have an importance, and probably reflects also the licensing to the really emerging economies according to these patterns. Just in conclusion, again, I think the technology mechanism that has been created under UNFCCC is going through a really critical phase. It is really completing its institutional structure build-up, and I think a more active engagement is needed from different stakeholders. And maybe when in Durban, when some of the pending questions are addressed, maybe we can witness a stronger engagement. And I think in terms of intellectual property, and I will not dwell on that much, we need to draw lessons from the available empirical evidence to overcome the impasse on this issue in the climate change negotiations. And we've just published a publication, a note, a policy note on this issue that tries to chart a number of, identify a number of principles, parameters, based on all of the discussion to move forward with this in the climate change negotiations. And I'm happy maybe to mention that a bit more, maybe if there are questions there, but I wanted to focus more on just the wider technology issue, because I thought that was the most important focus of the panel.
Focus on the role of private sector. And Pete's presentation demonstrates that, in fact, most of the research and innovation is taking place in private sector. You cannot ignore private sector. Yet, in fact, we see in Africa private sector at the periphery of R&D. In most of Africa, I don't see, in fact, private sector investment in R&D, leave alone environmental R&D, but R&D generally. It's only in South Africa where you get about 51% of total expenditure on R&D coming from private sector. The rest of Africa, you don't see private sector in R&D, and it raises a number of policy issues. If Africa is going to effectively engage in climate change mitigation, adaptation, Africa has to, in fact, stimulate private sector investment in R&D. So I find that a very important policy policy issue. I think the other point is common points around the intellectual property protection. We've spent the last at least 20 years just talking about whether intellectual property protection is a barrier to transfer of technology. And Ahmed's presentation, and in fact the three presentations, demonstrated that there's no evidence. There's no evidence. And Pete made this statement that in fact wise use of intellectual property protection to stimulate technological innovation is key. But I mean, at this COP, we are again hearing the old statements that the developed countries should relax intellectual property protection to facilitate transfer of technologies to developing countries. We also, again, still really held in this north-south paradigm, technology being transferred from the north to the south. The presentations, in fact, show that some developing countries are sources of technologies, and China, Brazil, South Africa, which indicates, in fact, the need to focus a bit more on south-south technology transfer. There's the issue of new institutional arrangements, and we heard about the International Innovation Center, the technology mechanism, and for me, it's really it's not the creation and existence of these bodies that will matter. It's the ability of developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, to effectively engage in these institutions, and that depends to a large extent on their domestic technological capacity. I think an issue that has emerged from the three presentations is if countries do not have capacity, technological capacity, you can have a technology mechanism out there with the information on technologies. You can have technology needs identified, but the ability to move into technology procurement, into technology use, will not will really matter. So I think an issue is one is really building technological capacities of developing countries. It's not dependent again on intellectual property protection or the existence of these international institutions. And I think there's also the issue of building innovation systems, national innovation systems, which is is really critical. And innovation systems are essentially defined as around policies, institutions, both private and public linkages, getting institutions to articulate that would really matter. Again, in the case of Africa, the challenge is one is, again, bring private sector in. Without private sector, we are not going to see the emergence and growth of innovation systems in most of Africa. So for me, the take home points are private sector is very critical. You can't ignore private sector, and therefore the need to put in place policies that will stimulate private sector engagement in R&D and innovation. I think the other point is one is intellectual property protection, very important, but there's no evidence that in fact intellectual property protection is necessarily a barrier to transfer of technologies. I think ability to use intellectual property protection matters. And here I think in the case of Africa, again, is really a challenge. The African countries that have intellectual property protection offices or patent offices, if you go around, you find out that in fact those offices are rarely used, not just by private sector, but even R&D institutes. a lot of investment has gone into creating those offices in a number of countries. But the use of those offices will matter. And then the use of new international institutions, the International Innovation Center, and the technology mechanism. And for me, again, it's the ability of developing countries to effectively engage in using those institutions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to all our panelists. We've got about half an hour left, so I hope we can engage the audience in a lively discussion. So let me open up to the floor. I think you've heard a lot from us, so now's your chance to object, agree, disagree, whatever takes your fancy. So, any reactions from the floor?
My name is Vuisani Sikobi from Department of Environmental Affairs, Pretoria, South Africa. Just a comment. Firstly, I just want to thank the speakers, the presenters for these informative presentations, especially on these intricate issues of IP. And having said that, I would have loved maybe one presenter if he could have made a clear differentiation between intellectual property and technology transfer. Because, you know, a layman like myself could have seen that these have been used interchangeably. I know Ahmed, to some extent, tried to sort of delineate the differences between the two. I happen to sit in a committee, just as that has been set by the government on intellectual property rights, and I'm representing environmental affairs on looking at IPR and climate change. So the question is to Pete, really, because there was a concern that came from some committee members that intellectual property rights, you know, we might sort of bring some kind of foreign kind of interventions which might not dovetail with the South African situation. And maybe Ahmed will want to pitch in this because he mentioned something like partnership or partnering and licensing. Maybe that can sort of allay that. So to you, Pete, to what extent do you think that is a fallacy? And I think John did mention that intellectual property rights do not necessarily transfer to technological transfer. I don't know to what extent do you guys agree or disagree with that kind of statement. Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Let's take the gentleman there and then come to the front.
I have a couple of comments. I want to, as a matter of politeness, I want to begin by agreeing. I agree with almost all the comments that John made at the end of his presentation, and also the ones that Pete made at the end of his presentation, saying that improving absorptive capacity is the real issue. I disagree with one of the quotes, and I don't think the author is in this room. There was a statement that intellectual property rights may prevent informal transfer through reverse engineering in the least developed countries. In fact, I would submit the least developed countries are have the most freedom to reverse engineer because of the statistics. In general, the large companies tend to file, if you're based in the United States, you file in the United States. If you file foreign, you tend to go to OECD type countries. You might file in Europe, Japan, perhaps Australia. It's very unlikely they'll file in the African countries. If there is no patent in the local African country, then they're perfectly free to reverse engineer. The problem is they don't have the capacity sometimes to do the reverse engineering, and if they do the reverse engineering, I don't think they have the capacity to implement it. And that's the real problem. And so it gets to Ahmed's discussion of the technology mechanism as the solution.
Just a couple comments and I guess requests for feedback on first the point on government research. I think it's pretty clear that governments oftentimes, when they give you money to, and we certainly know this from experience, when they provide money for R&D funding, there's strings attached. And I guess, Ahmed, my request is, there's a new proposal pending right now at the European Commission, which would essentially require that any technological outcome of a DG research-funded effort would need to be manufactured in Europe. I mean, I can tell you from our perspective as a global company at GE, that's a non-starter. We can't economically manufacture everything that we manufacture in Europe. Is that a good policy? I guess, you know, do we want to encourage this kind of exceptionalism for government-funded research, or do we want to create incentives that at least to some degree are aligned or can be fed into a commercial environment? So that's a question to Ahmed. And then secondly, you talked a lot about licensing, and clearly licensing is one way to diffuse technology. I totally agree. I'm always cross out transfer every time I see it and put diffusion because technology moves around through markets, not by operation of law in most instances. But Ahmed, what about joint ventures? What about trade? Is that technology transfer as well? Because at least from our experience, that's how most of it occurs. And should that be somehow disfavored vis-a-vis licensing? So.
Okay, maybe I'll start by those questions. Actually, I was not aware about this European Union requirement, and it was not the type proposal. Sorry, and it's not the type I'm thinking about, because that is a manufacturing requirement, etc. And I think in a globalized world of supply chains, etc. What we see in different countries, but not only in Europe, is what I call techno-nationalism coming back. You know, the idea that, you know, you want to promote national manufacturers. And I think in a globalized world where supply chains are globalized, etc., it's very difficult to move backwards on that. But it's not my domain of competence. But note that there has been similar issues in the US with the Bayh-Dole Act, because the Bayh-Dole Act also in a certain part requires manufacturing in the US. And Japanese auto manufacturer in the US had issues. I cannot go deeply in them, but had issues with the Bayh-Dole Act. But this is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to that if we recognize that there's government involvement in this area, right? Then and significant amounts of money that are put by governments through universities, through research centers. Should the commercialization of the results of the dissemination of results of this research be done exactly in the same way if it was a commercial company doing it, right? That is, I'm raising the question. I don't have the answer, but I think it's interesting to think about it. The example I mentioned is about the dissemination of. It's about scientific publications, actually. You know, so just an example, but I think it merits thinking. The issue about joint venture and licensing, I agree with you. But my understanding is that when part of a licensing can be part of a joint venture, right? If a company establishes a joint venture in a company with another company, part of that joint venture would be to license its technology to this company, for example, right? So yeah, I mean, I definitely subscribe to your view that again, especially for middle-income countries, trade is an important channel of technology diffusion, absolutely, and joint ventures, and yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, just just about your questions on intellectual property and technology transfer. I think there is some confusion the two. I mean, and many people equate the two, and it's not the case. I think personally, it's not the case. Technology transfer is a wider policy issue objective that I think it has been very clearly mentioned is impacted by a lot of issues, right? Finance, absorptive capacity, right? Your ability to use the technology. So there's many other factors that play a role in your ability to obtain technology, right? The commercial opportunity, the market size, et cetera, et cetera. Intellectual property is one aspect only, right? And there's often an overemphasis on it. I think I agree, but I also think it should not be totally disregarded as it plays no role whatsoever, right? And so the challenge is to find, to catch where it plays and where it doesn't play a role, and probably in many cases it is not the most critical factor in the equation. But again, you cannot exclude that in a case it can be, or could be, or can play an important role.
To the environmental affairs question, this is partly why I put up the definition of technology very early on. It's the making, using, and understanding of tools. Now, and I agree with the GE point that the word transfer is actually very strange. When have you transferred technology? If I give you a cell phone, have I transferred cell phone technology to you? Depends. Well, if I show you how to use it, then to that extent, yes, perhaps I have. Must I give you the cell phone and the diagrams for how the cell phone was built? That's another level of transfer. But does that mean you can build a cell phone? Probably not. So that transfer term, I think, is the problematic one. So at what point have you transferred technology? The question really is, are we able to access the technology that is available? And that accessing of the technology, if it's foreign owned in the first instance, we access it when a foreign investor comes and builds it in South Africa. The only reason they would build it in South Africa is if they know that that technology is safe. So that requires some protection of their intellectual property. So it's a strange one. Just the word technology transfer is problematic in its own right. If you understand technology to be about understanding, using, and making, the issue that comes up is I guess this techno-nationalism. Is we say we don't want people just to come build the stuff here. We want to make it ourselves. And that, in South Africa, that's actually not such a big requirement. We're not a signatory to WTO procurement agreements, so we can put in law a local content requirement and get away with it under the WTO. We are doing just that. So in terms of driving the local manufacturing, which I must stress, again, is a small part of the overall job creation, which is the big reason why we say we want to do it, because we want to create local jobs. It's really a small part of the overall jobs. We can drive it through other mechanisms other than saying, you must give us the intellectual property and we'll just make it here. That doesn't mean that we've got even the investors in country to build the plant, even if we did own the intellectual property. On the second point, yes, I mean, totally true. It's a very strange statement that, intellectual property rights could avoid reverse engineering. Yes, it's unlikely there'd be intellectual property rights in that country, and it's unlikely that there'd be the ability to reverse engineer. I agree with you. On the third point, just on this public-private interface, I think it's worth noting that this EU proposal is actually pretty much law in South Africa. We've had recently a revamp of intellectual property rights in South Africa, and that has been very much about anything that comes out of a South African university or South African public institute, that we hang on to it harder. It's very much in the opposite direction of open access. So that's not, and it would be this sort of techno-nationalism to an extent. But on the other hand, it's instructive to note that again in Europe, many of what is today renewable energy companies actually started as spin-offs from universities or public institutions. So I think the subtlety to the debate goes around where do we hand over the baton from the public sector to the private sector, that the private sector best commercializes, but that the public sector have a role to play in this very high-risk area where the technology is uncertain, where it's very much a public good that's being that's being produced. But then over time, the absolute natural way for many of these companies is to spin off from because you can imagine an SME can't afford to run a year-long or multi-year, decade-long research program before it gets to commercialization. That's the kind of thing, because of the public benefit, that the state should best do. So I think the debate must be informed by where do we hand over, and what is the respective roles and the complementary roles between the public and private sector.
Yes, 2 points. One is on tying strings to public R&D. In fact, for me, really the challenge is not having strings tied at all to public R&D in most of Africa. Very few African governments actually know where their money goes, how that money is used by public R&D institutions. There are no conditions that are set. And it's really worrying. Money is actually thrown at universities in some countries, but there are no demands on these institutions, including, in fact, demand that research results be published. You find very few African governments doing it. So I would actually encourage governments to really tie strings to the money that they give to public R&D. The issue of intellectual property protection and technology transfer. I recently reviewed 28 national technology needs reports. These are reports that have been prepared by 28 African countries as part of their efforts to identify specific technologies that they require for both adaptation and mitigation. And in only 2 countries from the 28, do you find reference to intellectual property protection? And those 2 countries, Kenya and South Africa, intellectual property protection is not referred to as a barrier to technology transfer. In fact, in the case of Kenya, the report states that Kenya is going to use its intellectual property protection regime to facilitate technology development and acquisition. In the case of South Africa, the reference, which is in fact just a sentence also, is about the costs of managing intellectual property protection, but not intellectual property protection as a barrier. But if you look at all the other countries, 26 countries, there's no reference to intellectual property protection as a barrier to transfer of technology. In fact, the barriers that are listed are issues to do with the weak scientific and technological capacities, financing, weak links between private sector and universities. So what surprises me very often is that when we come to the negotiations, when we come to the COPs, we talk about intellectual property protection as a barrier, but when we go back home, we essentially, our policies do not treat IPR as a barrier. So I'm just cautioning us is that at the national level, we do not consider IPR as a barrier to technology transfer, but out in negotiations, we talk as if, in fact, IPRs are barriers.
Yeah, I get to somehow end this this morning session. Actually, yeah, okay. Oh well, but so I'll just sort of everyone sort of responded to it, but I'd like to say, I mean, what do we say? What do we mean when we say innovate? I think people just tend to confuse intellectual property and invention with really the capacity to innovate. Innovation is about the ability to make commercially viable products. And this is, it signifies, in a way, a long road from a research laboratory, whether in a private firm or in a public laboratory, to the market. And it calls for a long series of things to fall in place. One of the things is, of course, the scientific capacity in the public research labs, like John has made the point, in Africa, in Asia, and so on. But it also calls for very strong private sector enterprises, enterprises that can actually recognize, take the risk, and collaborate. It calls for financing and investment available for this kind of risk to be taken in the local context. And it calls for actually a large number of systemic factors that help to factor in the local demand into the activities of these so-called entrepreneurs. It doesn't matter who does it. Sometimes you see that governmental firms are able to do this in a variety of settings, and sometimes you see that private sector firms are able to do it. But I think that the most frustrating thing for most of us who worked on this topic is that the entire discourse on intellectual property rights has somehow hijacked this away from pinning down the key factors that cause or impede the ability to innovate to intellectual property. In some sectors, it has been important. Like in the pharmaceutical sector, I think intellectual property rights have been important. But at the same time, trying to draw lessons from some sector which represents, in a way, an extreme case to all other sectors might also be dangerous. The other thing I want to talk about is this issue of trade. We find actually that trade in embodied goods is a very significant way in which technology is actually transferred. And also a lot of the work that I've done in a range of least developed countries shows that firms learn by being able to imitate and reverse engineer. They don't learn because they're able to participate in some sort of governmental technology transfer initiative, which is more rare. They do, sometimes it works, but it's more rare. And I mean, in such context, intellectual property might neither be a barrier nor be a facilitator, but it might be in some cases. And I think we need to draw that one is to walk on that thin line and identify the cases, like Ahmed pointed out, and I think that's where the challenge really is. And in the climate case, the technology mechanism shows somehow it's a move. Although it's a negotiated document, it's a move away from intellectual property right to technology diffusion, technology acquisition, assimilation, innovation. And I think it might be interesting if we would be able to move away from this unilateral focus on technology transfer and a lot of other agendas just like this. So.
We still have a little bit of time, so we can take a couple more questions or comments. Let's take two if there are any. So.
Just one comment on the joint venture aspect of the discussion. I have started a study where we're looking into some joint ventures in other countries, and there have been some examples where countries such as China, the companies have found the existence of patents owned by US companies as an incentive, because they are able to come under the protection of the existing patents owned by the US company, and the US company gets the benefit of the partnership, because if you go into, for example, a Chinese court, it's best if you have a Chinese company as part of your team when you go to enforce those patents.
Let me give an... Hello. Yes. Okay. Let me just give an example of that. GE has a joint venture with Harbin in the wind sector in China. It's 51% owned by Harbin and 49% owned by us. And much of the consideration in that joint venture, much of what we brought to the table was our intellectual property. And what did they bring to the table? Tremendous insight in market access and weight in the Chinese market. So I think that IP plays an important role when you're working with a player who has a lot of knowledge about the market and is capable of absorbing that technology and turning it into a manufacturing arrangement on-site, in-country, that is specifically appropriate for the needs in that particular jurisdiction. Because unlike in the medical sector, or in the medicine sector, you know, these technologies are highly contextual. You need to be distributing something, selling something in market that specifically meets the needs of that market. For example, in China right now, there's a 3.5 megawatt wind turbine. That's what the government wants, and you know, we're working with our local partner to deliver that.
But the question is for Ahmed. I think if I'm right, Ahmed, you showed a study that you did with the EPO about the difficulty of finding patents in databases. What do you think was the difficulty? Is it the information that goes into the databases on the legal status of a patent not updated, or what's inadequate about using the APO and finding what's available out there on green technologies?
Well, the challenges relate really, I mean, particularly in the case of green technologies, that if you're looking for wind, let's say turbines, there's not a single place to find the patents, because as manufacturing components, they are classified under different aspects of, let's say, turbines, the software, the different aspects that go into a wind turbine, right? But if you're interested in wind energy, right, you'll have to look into many different manufacturing classes of patent classification. So that is the main challenge in the case of clean energy, for example, if you want readily accessible information. But apart from this case, I mean, there's many challenges that in using patent information, from the fact that sometimes you don't have complete information, you have partial information, you have it in different languages. Not all countries have fully digitized their patent information or patent collections. So there's a long list of issues. I know WIPO is trying to address that and doing a lot of good work in this area. But it's an issue, especially for the entrepreneurs, I think, for the non-specialists, right? Because then you need the services of lawyers and of private firms to help you, go beyond these difficulties.
Just a final comment, which is a bit of a response to the UNCTAD presentation. Two key points that I just want to leave with you is the one that it would be great to move the debate on from the point of mitigation, which is, I think, very much a northern agenda, onto the energy access debate. And that for me is critical. But then the other point, that in terms of the huge amounts of money that we're spending, that political number of $100 billion, that spending the right money up front in things like establishing technological infrastructure in country is actually an area where there's a lot of bang for your buck. And that without that, you can waste spending the big amounts of finance on infrastructure because you'll build things that local countries can't maintain themselves. So just the criticality of getting that first step of getting the innovation infrastructure right, and that it's really a lot of return for the investment, I think is worth bearing in mind.
No, it's true, and I mean, it has system-wide effects. If you build innovation capacity, you are not just building innovation capacity for this sector. It has impact on how the same constraints are overcome, maybe in a variety of other sectors, and I think that needs to be borne in mind.
Okay, it's 10:30. We're finishing bang on time. So thanks very much to our panelists, and hope you enjoyed the discussion.